The question was, do we always put put wood floors in log buildings? No, it always depends on the client. I mean, it can be slab on grade, which means just a concrete slab. It can be gravel. It can be a wood floor. It depends what people are using it for. Some of the log building work we do, the important thing is that it's seen from the outside. Nobody's ever going to go in it. We restored Fort Atkinson in Omaha just last year. All those buildings have gravel floors because they're only meant to be viewed from the outside. If people are going to live in them, then it's a different story. But any of those things are possible. Yeah. Yes? So the question is, where do people get trained? And maybe more specifically is, where do young people get trained in this kind of work? And so I have a staff member on our team. He's 21, and he's at ACBA. That's the American College of the Building Arts in Charleston, South Carolina. There's also the Rhode Island School of Design. There's Massachusetts Art. There are programs at places like Yestermorrow. There's the Timber Framer Guild program in Keene, New Hampshire. Those workshops tend to be, can be expensive-ish, I guess, depending on how you view it. There are also Timber Frame Guild workshops. There's Tillers International just up the road in Michigan. They have workshops as well. So there are these workshops scattered around the country. Tillers Workshop, Yestermorrow, for example, where you can learn timber framing stuff. The restoration side of it is a little sparser. American College of the Building Arts in Charleston deals with it a little bit. But I think if people want to learn this stuff, there are those avenues. I spent 6 years in the Marine Corps as a combat engineer, so I had some broader construction experience. I grew up in a family situation that involved construction and carpentry. So I had a background that goes back into my early teens. But if you're starting at 18 or 19, that's, possibly even the military is a place to go to get some basic construction stuff, because it's important to know how to do the restoration stuff, but it's also important to understand how to deal with foundations and bricks and concrete blocks and roofs. So there is it is what I would call, and absolutely is a 10-year journey. We work a lot with the Compagnon program in France. We work a lot with Carpenters Fellowship in the United Kingdom. There's another program in Sweden called Stolpwerk. Generally speaking, these are 5 to 10-year training programs. So we've got to get this idea embedded in young people that it's not something you're going to learn in 6 months. That's the part of it we've got to get to. We've got to get folks understanding that this is a commitment to learning a trade, and that 2 years of training might get you some technical skill. So that's, I think, the harder thing to do. But also just access to education. And I think workshops are probably the best way to bring young people in and bring people in. We've hosted 35 workshops in the Midwest, our company, since 2001. And that's all been on pause for me since COVID. We haven't done a workshop in 4 years. We need to do more workshops, because part of getting young people involved is training old people to get the young people involved, I think. Because you all have to know what you're doing and be excited about it so that they get excited about it. And then I think the training opportunities will come. Yep?
Could you comment briefly on why barns originally were red?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. And everybody here is going to disagree with me. But barns are painted red to show prosperity. And barns are painted red because you're showing that you've got your act together. And barns are painted red not because Grandpa put a bunch of nails in a bucket and let them rust. Barns are painted red because that color historically has been a sign of prosperity for 600 years. And the people who brought red barn painting to this country knew that. And the reason that they're red is because Falu red is a byproduct of copper mining in Sweden, and it was quite available, but it wasn't cheap. But it's a sign of prosperity. And also, I believe, and I've talked to folks in Scandinavia about this, in Finland and in Sweden, and most recently I was at a conference in Sweden We were talking about this again with the organization Stolpberg. It also tends to be a bit of a mildewcide and a bit of a fungicide because it's made with copper as a pigment. So when the Greeks painted wooden temples, long before they built stone temples, they painted the ends of the joists blue with arsenic so that bugs wouldn't eat them. So part of it is an insect deterrent. And what I've found with this carpenter bee problem we have is it's an amazing deterrent to keep the bees away. They don't like that color red. But originally, it's people saying, I don't want, up until 1850 something, I don't want a wood barn anymore, because the bulk of history of the European culture with wooden buildings is that they're unpainted, or they're black, painted with pitch, or they're just wood. You didn't really paint your building until you really had your act together, maybe financially, and there was some level of prosperity there. The 19th century was an era, the late 19th century was an era of prosperity, and people painted their buildings red. Any other questions? Yeah.
Difference between a angled scarf joint and a 90-degree scarf joint.
Tabled, yep. So, yep. So did I repeat your question about barns being red? I think I did. So the question is difference between an angled or sloped scarf joint and a flat scarf joint. So angled scarf joints, flat, we'd probably use the word tabled. We'd call it a tabled scarf joint. Really has to do with how it's being used. And you can get more resistance in tension by using these angled scarf joints with multiple wedges. So if we're using a scarf joint in tension, then we might use an angled scarf joint with a bunch of wedges in it. If we're using a scarf joint in a vertical connection and we're worried about a lot of scissoring, we might use a tabled scarf joint. So in the examples that I showed, I had tabled scarf joints in vertical orientations and undersquinted joints, angled scarf joints in horizontal connections. Doesn't really hold true completely. There are some different engineering results with analyzing those joints. But you can get a lot more tension grab with these angled scarf joints because you have more surface area. Flat table has this surface area. When you angle it, you have a greater surface area, so you get more contact. Not quite a clear answer, but it is dependent on a couple of things. Yes?
Could you define people what you mean or how you identify a threshing barn?
How do you identify, question is, how do you identify a threshing barn? So we can just look at it from the standpoint of, we can look at it from a historical standpoint. So a threshing barn could be a barn that was never used for threshing, or it could be a barn that was used for threshing. And so what we find is that as time goes on, generations carry building styles with them long after the purpose for that is happened. So long after threshing, people stopped threshing in the middle out here. People kept building threshing buildings. But fundamentally, we can look at it a couple different ways. If it's a threshing floor, we can say, well, this is a swing beam, and these two posts are gone, and we have this big area here where we can thrash grain. We can also look at it from the standpoint of a 3-bay threshing barn, which is a 4-bent 3-bay threshing barn, and this is the aisleway, and we've got a mousestead wall here that keeps all the grain inside of the drive bay. And we can look at it from the standpoint even earlier, where the threshing barn has a threshold that pops up at the door opening that keeps the grain from going outside of that door. So we can look for these artifacts of threshing, which occurred in barns for thousands and thousands of years until the late 19th century. And so threshing barns keep being built long after people are threshing because that's just what we build. We build 3-bay barns. And we put mousestead walls in them. And we put a little granary over there in the corner. So what makes it a threshing barn probably is the footprint. And the fact that it has a drive bay with either doors on, full-size doors on both ends, a full-size door on this end, and an opening on this end that opens. A mousestead wall that goes on both sides, and possibly the remnants of a threshold, though not likely. So that's really what defines a threshing barn. Whether or not it was ever used for threshing, who knows? I mean, there were threshing barns built during the wheat booms of the Midwest. They were used for threshing for 5 years, and then they were never used for threshing again. So it's the mousestead walls on both sides of the aisle. It's the clear openings on both ends. And it has nothing to do with the quantity of bays. It doesn't have to be a 3-bay barn. It could be a 9-bay barn that has 2 threshing bays in it. It's just that we often think of a 3-bay English threshing barn because that's what was built in England for 1,000 years or longer for small farmers, medium farmers. But I think fundamentally it's the mousestead walls that define it and the openings on both sides. And I think that taking the next step, clearly the swing beam, which is an unsupported span at the tie beam connection with these posts not here. And then somebody still built that same thing in 1900. They probably didn't build it with the swing beams, but they probably built it with the bay and the mousestead walls. And part of the mousestead wall is not only to keep the grain inside, but it's to keep the hay that's piled in the dirt over here or on top of a wood floor from spilling out into the drive bay, what we call the drive bay. Yes? Yes, you.
Okay, talk about moving the barns now. What is the cost of, I know it's going to vary, but of moving a barn?
How far? Oh, the question was, what is the cost of moving a barn? So the question would be how far and in what way? What are the cost factors in moving a barn? Dismantled or as a unit?
It would have to be dismantled.
So generally speaking, if you wanted me to take this barn down, not the one that's connected to it, and pack it up and put it on a truck, it's probably going to cost about $80,000. And if there's nothing wrong with it, fantastic. It's probably going to cost about the same amount of money to put it back up. That's just the frame. We still have to put a foundation underneath it. We've got to put siding on it. We've got to put a roof on it. We've got to put a floor in it. Probably we can, well, maybe on that one, we can save the joists. But it's about 60 to 80,000 to take them down. Now you can find a crew of people that don't work very safely and don't wear harnesses and stand on top of ladders and don't use aerial equipment to do it for $40,000. But I can't do that. So you're going to see a range. You're going to see a range of taking a barn down this size from 40 to 80,000. $400,000 to move this building and put it back up. I just did one for the Amish Heritage Museum in Arthur, Illinois. And try as they might, no matter how many donations they got, I think they still spent $600,000. It's taller than this one, though. It's sort of this tall from grade, but it's wood all the way to the ground. So it's like a 20-foot sidewall, and maybe 20 feet longer. But $800,000 to move a building and put it back up. We can start to see why $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $80,000, $150,000 to fix a building is worth it. Because, as somebody pointed out, construction costs are so high right now, and labor is so high. So a big part of my approach in restoration is, when do we use this sometimes instead of something else? I'm happy to put joinery in wherever you want. You just got to pay for it. You know, we can put screws in too, and I'm happy to do it in any way we want to, but that's what the whole first half of my conversation was about, or my presentation was about. We got to figure out why you're doing what you're doing so that we can make those decisions, and that's part of moving a building. Sometimes it makes sense to pick it up. We got a couple barns in Indiana we're going to pick up, and the lifting costs are $28,000 to $60,000. A lot less than taking it apart. Foundation might be $40,000 to $80,000. Respectively. But, so anyway.
Follow-up.
Yeah.
Can you move them intact for any distance?
Yeah, so the question is, can you move a barn intact? I can move it as far as you want to move it until we hit a bridge or a stream or a power line that they won't take down. And that's absolutely the truth. You know, I moved 11 buildings in Lockport, Illinois in 2 weeks one time, 15 years ago. and 5 of them were on dollies. And the bill from Ameren to take down the power lines was $180,000. We move a barn down the road here, chances are I can sit on top of the ridge with a pole and push the power line up as long as I'm within 27 feet, which is generally the rule of thumb. Sometimes we just take the roof off. So in this building, it's a good example, you could take the rafters off, you could pop the queen posts out because they're just pegged in, and you could take this box down the road, and now we can move it a lot further. Width doesn't really matter until we hit a bridge or something, you know, but distance isn't a factor until those things come into play. But 15 miles, sure. A mile across the field, 2 miles, you bet. Yeah. Yes?
Is there a market for old barn timbers? Where would you get them if you needed to replace a renovation?
So your question is there a market for old barn timbers? And your question might be, where can I buy them? Is that accurate? So there's a guy in Peoria, Illinois named Dirk Fox. He boasts on Facebook that he has 1 million board feet of timber. There's a guy in Ohio named Joe Saladin. He boasts that he's got 1 million board feet of old timber. And there's a company in New York State called New Energy Works, and they boast they've got $1 million worth of, or 1 million board feet of timber. So these are people that are professional dismantlers, and what they do is do what I don't do, which is go around and take buildings down. But those are the places that you can find that stuff. And more often than not, you know, it's going to be probably reclaimed industrial timber. And you know, probably timber out of barns like this. Has a lot of mortise pockets and stuff like that in it. So I don't deal a lot with reclaimed timber. But those are 3 places that you can just call them up on the phone and they'll ship you an 8x8. Or siding, or whatever it is that you need. Siding is about $13 a square foot to buy. It can be as cheap as $4 a square foot. I can buy new siding for $2.50 a square foot to $3 a square foot. I don't deal in old siding. We put new siding on things. Old timbers cost anywhere from $7 to $20 a board foot. I can buy new timber for $2 to $4 a board foot, so I don't deal with old wood, plus it's full of nails and hard. So unless it's an aesthetic choice, I usually advise just go with new material rather than buy it. I mean, shipping alone from 500 miles away is $1,200 now for something like that, LTL. So the costs are pretty high, unless you just, you know, you got somebody down the road who's got a, but to go to one of those purviews where they specialize in this, it's quite expensive, quite expensive. Yes?
What's your take on metal siding versus wood?
So what's my take on metal siding versus wood? So I think that wood siding lasts longer. I think that metal siding is cheaper. And I think that wood siding is more aesthetically pleasing. But I think it's a budget question. If it's a question of saving the buildings, we absolutely need to put steel on it because it's cheaper and faster. So it has to be a budget decision. My personal preference is to put wood siding on buildings whenever we can, but I fully understand putting steel siding on buildings. And I showed the Wapsipinicon mill. The head house up there had some kind of beaded T&G, horizontal beaded T&G on the walls. I put a really fancy kind of horizontal steel siding on it because it's 100 feet in the air. And every single time they go to paint it, you know, they got to rent a 140-foot man lift. So that's a great application for steel siding. It's no different than somebody deciding, I'm going to put steel siding on my barn because, you know, I can't afford to do wood, and this is the difference between saving it and not. So that's my take on it. But my preference is wood siding. Yeah?
I may have missed it, the linseed oil paint, did you give a reference on that?
So the company we buy it from is called Earth and Flax. And the product, there's a couple products out there, but Viking paint is the one that we use most often. And it's available from a company called Earth and Flax. And the oil that we use is available from Heritage Timber Frames, not Heritage Timber Frames, Heritage Oil. And we buy the exterior product. She sells it in 1 gallon. We buy it in 55-gallon drums, but you can get it in 1-gallon containers.
Earth and what?
Earth and flax.
Flax?
Flax like the seed. Earth and Flax is their website. Viking Paint is the product that we use quite often for, they make a white, they make a red, make a black. You know, we paint tobacco barns black and dairy barns white sometimes, and you know, red barns red, but they make all of those products. Ochre yellow is another color we've used. That's another Scandinavian, European color that we see sometimes.
What was the Scandinavian name of the red?
So the question is, what's the Scandinavian name for red paint? The red paint that we use is Falu, F-A-L-U. So if you Wikipedia Falu, you'll get all the background on that paint pigment, because obviously it's a key component of Scandinavian buildings. So once you do a little bit of digging, you find all this wonderful information about these paints. And you start to see a little bit about why it became the paint that people used in the 19th century.
So does the white paint have the linseed oil in it too?
So the question is, does white paint have linseed oil in it? Yes. Has linseed oil in it? No lead, but linseed oil. Mm-hmm. Yes?
What do you do with wood siding that's deteriorating where it attaches to the bottom?
So the question is, what do we do about wood siding that's deteriorated at the bottom? I didn't have a slide of that, but we've dealt with it a couple times. Sometimes I just, if it's a little bit, snap a line at 12 inches, and I just go around and cut it all off, and I put what's called a water table board. That's the sort of architectural term for that trim piece. A water table board with a drip cap in a horizontal application around the perimeter. The other option, you know, girts on barns are 4 feet on center 99% of the time. So you come up the first 4 feet, snap a line at the girt line, put in a drip edge, and then I just side that bottom 4 feet all the way around with the same kind of siding. But the water table board is a down and dirty way to cover up somebody's sill. It's a fast way to deal with 6 inches of rot on a ground barn and reintroduce it. You can do it out of treated lumber. You know, you can do it like water table boards in 19th century houses that project from the plane of the siding a little bit. You can put furring strips on it. You can pack out the water table board and put a drip cap on it. And then we've got something that's protecting the sill at the bottom.
But aren't the boards a different size, and so it looks kind of odd?
Well, if you have a barn with boards that are siding that's a different width, then you'd have to rip it, or you'd have to deal with the oddness. Depends on budget. Your question?
Yeah, so I think it's like linseed oil paint, you can paint
Your question was, what do you do about barns that have existing paint on them, and how do we deal with putting Viking paint over existing paint? So, you know, we did one that was fully painted a couple of years ago in white paint, and we corncob blasted the outside of the building. And about 50% of the paint came off, so we painted that with the linseed oil paint, and that was it. And what's going to happen is that modern paint's going to come off in the next 5 to 10 years, and they're going to have to paint that again. So that's the downside to switching horses midstream, is that you're going to have paint that's going to flake off, but you're going to start building this situation where you don't have to paint it like that again, because linseed oil paint doesn't peel, doesn't pop, never needs to be scraped. And because of the type of paint it is, you don't have to get all wrapped around the axle about cleaning mold and mildew off the building either.
Is there a way to know if it is linseed oil? 'Cause we don't
What's on there?
Yeah.
You could do a lead paint swab, and because if it's got, you know, that would be one way. But I think, you know, the simplest way, I mean, chances are, I mean, depending on how old it is, if it's pre-1950 paint, it probably isn't. I mean, it probably could be. If it's post-1950 paint, it probably just isn't linseed oil paint, probably. But it's going to, you know, linseed oil paint might crackle. It might have crackle marks in it. It has a more matte appearance as it ages. And then the difference and the reason why linseed oil paint is so much better is that it's not like wrapping your building in saran wrap, which is what you're doing with modern paints and asphalt shingles, by the way. You're wrapping your building in saran wrap and you're not letting it breathe. What linseed oil does is it carries the pigment into the wood fiber. So if you have a building that looks like faded, then that's probably linseed oil paint because it pigmented the wood fiber. Modern paints don't do that. They create this impermeable barrier, which is why they peel, which is why they don't work, which is why we should all stop using them. And yes?
So speaking of barn breathing, if you decide to go with steel siding, could you add more vents?
Yeah, so the question is barn breathing in relation to steel siding and adding more vents. So definitely we do what we call a lattice work, which means that we'll run a set of horizontal furring strips and a set of vertical furring strips, and we might put the siding on that, which creates that air barrier in there, which allows it to breathe, and then vent out through the top. You don't necessarily need 2 layers of lattice work with steel siding. You could do 1, especially if the rib on the siding is fairly large. If it's not ribbed siding and it's something more like standing seam that's fairly flat, then you probably need double lattice work. If it's got a rib in it, then just running horizontal furring strips you definitely got to hit the girts with your furring strips. Most steel siding, it seems like they want you to put a fastener every 30 inches or something like that. So you might need to do furring strips 2 feet on center, but the rib should carry it out, and then a perimeter of mesh at the top should vent that wall. Depending on the height of the wall, it might be a 6-inch mesh vent at the top of the steel siding. And that'll keep the water from collecting there and just rotting out the furring strips. So we use green treat furring strips for the first 8 feet from grade for a reason, and that's really because if you buy crappy whitewood to do this with from Menards, then it's going to rot. If you put steel siding on a building, it's going to rot. So you've either got to vent it or you got to use treated lumber the whole time. Because if you put steel siding on a barn without furring strips, then probably the steel siding, well, not probably, it's possible, it could blow off because you can't get a long enough fastener to actually bite into anything sometimes that's any good. Unless you're lucky and you got fantastic wood siding, but then why did you put steel siding on it? But if you don't, and your siding is junk, then put a furring strip on it so you got a fresh bite. And this goes back to, if you have a relatively bad wall, put a 2x-nailer on it instead of a 1x-nailer so that you can really put a structural screw and you wrap that whole wall in a solid furring strip. That also gives you a lot of ventilation. Sometimes we put on something like Tyvek house wrap before we put the furring straps on, because it's like at that point, well, why don't we also do something to try to keep the wind from blowing through this building so dramatically in the wintertime? That's another step we sometimes take, is adding house wrap into this process. Any other questions? Yes?
You mentioned a sealer to prevent carpenter ants.
Oh, so the question is about what kind of products do we use for carpenter ants and termites? So Borasol, B-O-R-A-S-O-L, available on Amazon. You buy what's called glycol-based Borasol, and you can put it on with a garden sprayer. Timbor is T-I-M-B-O-R. It's a powdered product that you could mix in a garden sprayer. Both of those are effective against things like powder post beetles and other insects that attack wood from the outside in. They will work with termites, but you really need the penetration. I mean, termites are already inside the building.
Rick, quick question on can you apply those to timber that it has already been stained?
Yeah, I think you could apply them to timber. The question is, can you apply them to timber that's already been stained? Yeah, I believe so. Not painted, but stained. Yeah, as long as it's not this coating, the synthetic coating that's like plastic.